Bringing in everybody. All right. So in the spirit of moving ahead, because it's a couple of minutes past, and I know we want to make sure we have time for questions and conversation with Eve, let's get started. So before Eve starts, I have a reminder, which is there's an upcoming Works in Progress talk by Becky Matz on March 30th from 12 to 1. And if you would like more details, go to the Create website and you can find out everything you need to know. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague and co-conspirator in all things epistemic, Eve Manz. And Eve is an assistant professor of education and specializing in science education. Her research focuses on the development of epistemic practices in math and science. And Eve will tell you that is supporting students to participate in making and using knowledge in powerful disciplinary ways. Eve seeks to understand how to design learning environments so that practices such as modeling, experimentation, and argumentation are meaningful and useful for elementary school students. She also analyzes how these practices contribute to the development of content knowledge. Eve works closely with elementary level, in-service and pre-service teachers to design curriculum and test new approaches for engaging young students in science. She draws from her experience teaching elementary school and directing curriculum development for the Eli Whitney Museum, which is in Hamden, Connecticut. So, without further ado, here's Eve.
Okay, so thanks for having me here today. What I'm going to talk about is work that I have been doing and hope to do in the future, opening up the empirical investigations, the experiments that elementary students do to see more meaningful approximations of science practices. And I'll start by backing out to talk about the landscape within which this work is situated more broadly, and then I'll get in deeper. But I didn't know exactly who my audience was going to be, so I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Many of you, I know this is not something I need to do, but I'll just locate my work really briefly in the recent movement in science education to more effectively represent science and help students develop science understandings. And at the center of that is the idea that, which drives the 2012 NRC framework, as well as the next generation science standards, that rather than teaching students content understandings or pieces of knowledge, we should be helping them gain facility with scientific practices and ways of doing that that represent how science work looks like. What science work looks like is helping them co-develop practices and knowledge, and do that through social activity. So when scientists think about what counts as a good experiment, a useful measure, or a useful explanation, that work always involves both engaging in practice and pulling on and developing knowledge, content understandings. And they do that in social activity. They, much as I'm doing to you, they present to peers, they critique each other's work, and they work to agree on something as a community. So this is the space that I seek to make visible to students and that many science educators do right now. And here's my diagrammatic representation of what that's looked like in science education so far, and then I'll further locate my work. So a major way that this vision has been instantiated in classrooms has been taking this piece and opening it up. So explanations of how the world works are not facts, but they're developed by people using evidence. And using evidence to convince others that particular explanations are trustworthy. And I think there's been a lot of really nice work in science education looking at what exactly does it mean to open up that work of explanation and supporting explanations with evidence. And we've developed some really nice principles for designing learning environments and thinking about supporting teachers. So posing tasks with multiple plausible explanations. Framing students' work is about finding something out. Scaffolding desired components, helping students think about when and why they use evidence, what it looks like to reason about that evidence, and supporting them to take on audience roles, to talk with each other, as opposed to only to the teacher. An aspect of this practice-based work that I think has been a little less problematized and we know a little less about is this movement from the world to the construction of evidence. And I think this is a little less prominent in the literature. So how do we support students to design an experiment, to choose what to measure, to interpret whether their experiment helped them find anything out, and especially at the elementary school level. I'll go into why I think we really need to do this. So the question that I seek to ask and that I'll talk about today is how we open up the work that elementary students do with experiments. And I'm going to argue that by doing so, we can better see meaningful approximations of scientific practice, but also deeper content understandings. But that is a complicated process. And so to do that work, the questions that I've been seeking to address are like, what are the key moments and opportunities within elementary students' work with experiments that we might want to open up? What aspects of that work are worth paying attention to? What aspects of the learning environment need to be in place for students to deeply consider those aspects of investigation and for exploring them to be meaningful to them? And what do teachers need to know and be able to do to guide that work? And so in the talk today, I'm going to tell you something about the theoretical framework I use to guide my approach to answering those questions. And then I'll provide a detailed description of work I've been doing with elementary school students, sharing how I use theory, how I think about the design of learning environments, and what I take to be the implications of that work so far. And then I'll go into work that's more recent and work I hope to do. So some professional development that I've started designing for teachers around ideas of uncertainty within science and what I'm learning from that. And then I have this kind of like future vision of what I'm going to do, and there are a lot of people here that I'd love feedback on that vision from. And so I would love questions about sort of that vision and plan and feedback on it, and that's where I'm going to end. So really briefly, let me talk about how I conceptualize practices and knowledge. I take a sociocultural view of practices, so I think about them as repeated, shared activities that are enacted to solve problems. But really importantly, I think that they're developed, appropriated, and adapted in communities. So what this means to me is we can't really identify a practice that scientists engage in and teach it directly to students in the classroom, expecting them to adopt it unproblematically. I think there's way too many differences between the activity systems within which students and scientists enact these practices for that approach to be really useful. And so I'll talk to you about my alternative approach. But I treat knowledge in a similar way using situated theories. So I look closely at the various ideas that students bring to instruction and how they use those ideas, recruit them in their work with science, and deepen them, rather than whether they do or don't have a canonical explanation, though I want to get toward that explanation. So in my work, I tend to take the following approach. I seek to really problematize and unpack and develop a deep understanding of the practices that I want to engage students with. So I tend to draw on philosophical writing and studies of scientists in action to do this work, and to ask, like, what's the purpose of the practice when scientists are engaging in it? And then how do I create a learning environment in which the purpose of that practice and desired elements are made visible to students, where it makes sense for them to engage that practice in the work as they're doing it now? And then I look at how knowledge is recruited and extended through engagement in those practices. One aspect that I have been really exploring in my recent work and that I want to talk to you about today is the role of uncertainty in scientific activity. So we'll come back to these two figures that I put up at the beginning of the talk, the world and the scientists or students who are trying to understand it. So when we look at what people or scientists do to understand the world, it's difficult to understand. They employ tools, experiments, incredibly complex machines such as the Higgs boson detector to try to capture the world, to get it to reveal its secrets to them. And when the world talks back, yes, it provides evidence, but it doesn't usually do so in really clear ways. It does what Pickering calls resist. It resists the capture. It's capture by humans. So evidence is usually not immediately clear. In these cases, it's unclear also whether it's the practices at fault. So maybe the Higgs boson detector is not well designed. Maybe it's that trial, it was broken. As we saw, if any of you have seen, I'm trying to remember the name of the movie, but there's a fascinating movie about all the iterations of work with that detector in order to get it to do something that scientists could consider trustworthy. But it's also possible that the conceptual account, our understandings of the world, are at fault. We don't know if there is a Higgs boson or not. We didn't, right? I'm trying to remember what the recent discovery about that is. So it's only when scientists look at evidence that's resisting capture, what they have to do is reconsider both the practices and conceptual accounts that they have. And it's only when those two are brought in line with each other that what they call knowledge is produced or agreed on by community members. So if you think about what it means to be like a scientific community working around and agreeing on a fact, it's being able to navigate these relationships between practices and conceptual accounts and agree that they're well enough aligned to enable us to be relatively sure of something or to do something of the work that we want to do. So what are the implications of this perspective for working with elementary students? What about this do we want to represent for them? So one, I think really strongly that uncertainty drives scientific practice. Without it, without students experiencing something of that uncertainty about both their practices and conceptual accounts, there's really little reason for them to engage in practices or to develop new ways of engaging in practice or to reconsider their ideas. And furthermore, for this work to really resemble something of what scientists do, students and teachers need to participate in developing what Karen Norsatina calls an epistemic culture, by which I mean they're deciding things that are of consequence for their work together. Sorry, I'm realizing my timing, oh no, this timing is okay. My timing on one thing is off. So this vision stands in real contrast to how experiments are usually represented in elementary classrooms and how elementary students are engaged in them. And in general, the work of planning, conducting, and interpreting the results of experiment is really highly specified in elementary school curricula. So this is a typical experiment that elementary students do across the country in third grade classrooms. They grow Wisconsin fast plants. They put them in different experimental conditions in order to understand the effect of a variable such as light. If they're given any choice in what they do, it's usually which of several variables to test. So do you want to test light, water, fertilizer, space? Which one will you keep the same? You'll choose one to change, and what are the variables that you'll keep the same? They're usually told exactly which outcomes to measure and how to measure them. So here we have directions for measuring the height of the plant, measuring from the soil up to the apex below the level of the leaves. And then they're also usually given a data table on which to record those measures. And then told to plot one or more, usually height because it's the easiest to compare. So what curricula usually do is focus on providing clear evidence in support of a desired content understanding. It's important that students see the result that plants need light, rather than helping them understand the practices that would actually be involved in deciding what to study, how to represent one of those variables, what to measure and how to measure it. So my work with students has looked at how we might open up some of these aspects of investigation work, and I'm going to share with you one example of how I've done that. So this is my dissertation study. This is an area behind a school. We call it the Wild Backyard, and it's basically an area that we ask the custodian to stop mowing. And then we engage third grade students in studying it. The study was a multi-year design study that involved third grade students, about 18 to 20 each year, in a southeastern urban public elementary school. So one of the ways, one of our content goals in doing this work was for students to see in the backyard the idea of differential success, that different plants were successful in different amounts of light. Strawberries tend to grow near the wall, whereas crabgrass tends to grow more out in the sunny areas. So this is the content understanding that we're seeking to help them develop. And this is, again, similar to some of those goals that I shared in the Fast Plants experiment. Plants need light. In this case, different plants need different amounts of light. So to do so, we helped the students develop an experiment in which they placed Wisconsin fast plants in different amounts of light. This looks similar to the experiment that I showed you in the previous slide, but here it's developed by the students to model an actual more complex system. So that's one change. In addition, we engaged the students in actually deciding what to look at. What about the plants could they observe to see if the amount of light mattered for the plants? And how could they represent that for their classmates? So we used drawings, we collected data, the students developed data, this in case was height, also number of seed pods. The students developed representations of that data. So what is going on here, and what these arrows are representing, is that there's significant uncertainty built into the experiment, and we really wanted to engage students with this uncertainty. So as they seek to design the experiment, how can they represent shade? What does it mean to represent the shady area of the backyard versus the light area versus an area under this tree that they think probably gets some shade, but maybe not all the time, not in the way that the area by the school wall does? What about the plant signal plant success? Does height matter more or number of seed pods? Once they see that the Wisconsin fast plants grown in sun all the time, 24 hours a day, are the most successful. How does that and does it not help them understand the backyard? Do all plants actually need that amount of light? So these are areas of significant uncertainty. In addition, the experiment itself provided some surprises. So for example, the plants grown in the shade initially grow the tallest. They're basically putting all their energy into reaching the light. But then they peter out and die. And this is a surprising result for students that they have to deal with. So here, the idea is that we wanted to see what practices students would engage in as the result of these uncertainties we were presenting to them. And then we positioned students as needing to construct and critique those links between the backyard and the experiment and the data models, and the experimental results and their explanation, so that we wanted to set up the system as something that the students would need to develop and agree on as a community. So what had they learned as a whole involves agreeing on the links between each of these aspects of the experiment. So I'll share with you briefly how I've analyzed some of this data. I'm not going to go too deeply into the analytic method. I can certainly answer questions about it if you want. This experiment took place over about 6 weeks, 17 lessons. And to understand how and why it seeded new forms of practice and understandings, I took that whole span of lessons, reduced it to periods of time where students were debating how to set up the experiment or how to interpret its results, and then used grounded analysis to develop a set of categories to describe what was happening, focusing on what aspects, what kinds of activity they were engaging in, what aspects of the experiment they were considering, and then what conceptual resources they were drawing on. So what I'm going to do is talk about 3 forms of activity, or share with you briefly 3 forms of activity they engaged in. I'm going to compare 2. So 3 forms of activity that the students engaged in as they worked on this experiment were: 1, defining attributes; 2, mapping between the experiment and the target system, the backyard; and 3, figuring out how they could generalize across cases. And what I found was that this is a simplified representation of what I found, was that these uncertainties that we designed in, when combined with teacher invitations and practices that encourage these forms of activity and social activity, led to really rich conceptual opportunities for students. So debates in which they actually called on and developed important ideas, and that these debates we could use to support new ways of using practices and ideas. And my analysis suggested that what went on is in the first 2 of these forms of activity, there were some really important uncertainties. In the third, the uncertainties that we'd hoped to develop didn't materialize. And students' practice and the ideas that they developed looked really different, I think, as a result. So I'll go deeply into one of them, the first, just to kind of show you what I mean about both uncertainty and the development of practice, and do a brief comparison to this form of activity that I think didn't materialize into something as powerful. And I can talk about the middle one, mapping, later, if people are interested, because I think it is really neat. So as students made claims about which plants were doing better, they needed to compare the plants based on particular attributes: color, size, presence of features, health. And what defining those attributes meant doing was involving members of the community in elaborating what they meant by an attribute or requesting that others do so. So for example, one of the claims that one of the students made was that the plants in the sun were all dying. And here's what happened as he did so. 2 students immediately jumped in. Azad said, "I don't see anyone dying." And Brady said, "How do you know it's dead?" So what both students are really doing here is they're contesting the notion that Dante can unproblematically see this thing he's calling death, right? They're basically saying, no, I don't see them dying. In turn, what Dante does is he begins to engage in what Pickering calls interpretation. He says, you don't see those leaves that are getting dried up. He's starting to define death by bringing in leaves. A number of students immediately jump in. 6 students talk within about 12 seconds. Alex says, those are old leaves. Jasmine says, those are the seed leaves. That's why they're dying. Chad says, no, they're not. He's actually going over. He's gotten out of his seat to go look at the plants. Azad says, those are the leaves that grew first. Those are the seed leaves. Those are the old leaves. They're trying to grow new ones. So each of these students is indicating that drying up does not involve death, and they're calling on some aspects of plant growth that they've learned about to do so. Dante then in turn goes back to the plants And he says, no, I see some spiky leaves. So those are the leaves that come later, the actual true leaves, not the seed leaves. I see some spiky leaves that are brown. So he's changing his definition again. He's trying to convince the other students that the plants are dying. So let's look at what exactly is happening here. So I'd argue the students are struggling with a really real uncertainty, and that's that the plants are changing over time, which causes them to resist the student's description. They're often changing in ways the students can't anticipate or describe. How do they know the plants are dying until they've actually died, right? And what I found was that 12 of 16 episodes in which students were engaged in defining attributes had to do with attributes that changed over time, where the plants were actually changing. So the teacher modeled definitional talk. This is something that we knew we wanted to incorporate in the classroom. She often asked the kids, like, what do you mean by? But for students, they picked up that practice, and it became meaningful to them as they struggled to define change and as their classmates disagreed with them. So here we have the uncertainty and the social disagreement, I would argue, is what makes this meaningful for the students, while the teacher absolutely is interacting and supporting the practice, but it's when these two are in place that the students are taking it up. And I'm gonna just really briefly pull on this, but I wanna actually kind of move on to the teacher work as well. But I found that in these conversations where students were questioning and developing definitions, they engaged with ideas in three interesting ways. So they differentiated ideas. There, the difference between the seed leaves and the true leaves became important to them. They related ideas. Leaves became related to processes of plant lives, and they began to call on explanations and predictable processes to justify their ideas. In turn, in this class, defining attributes in terms of life cycle processes became very consequential to making and supporting claims about plant success. And this became a classroom norm. So in fact, this was a little problematic for the classroom teacher. At the end of the work, she wanted to kind of close the activity and have the students agree that the plants in the sun were doing best because they had all developed seed pods, which she and the students had agreed were important. But the students actually argued that these little, the little pistils where that had not yet grown into seed pods could be growing into seed pods, so that her desire to close this experiment was premature, because as we know, plants will continue to develop. They could be just developing a little later. You don't know yet. So they're using really sophisticated processes of definition in terms of life cycle processes to in fact argue against their teacher who wants to end the experiment. In contrast, you know what I think I'll do? I'm going to skip over the generalizing because I don't think it's quite as interesting, and I want to get into how I'm thinking about the implications of this for teacher work. But I'm happy to talk about the failed practices of generalizing that we tried to put into place, as well as the mapping later. So what I see as the implications of this work is that by building these uncertainties into students' work, I can start to predict both what practices they'll engage in and what important ideas they will develop or call on as they engage in those practices. So I've done this experiment now 3 times with kids, and I can predict that as students seek to discuss what the plants are doing, they're defining attributes, which calls on ideas of plant life cycle, and as they go back to think about why different things are happening in the experiment in the backyard, they explore these really important practices of model fit, which bring up important ideas of differential success. We tested one kind of plant, and these are not all plants, so different plants might do well in different places. So I can start to predict these kind of idea-practice pairings that are going to come up. The implications, I think, of this for our work with teachers and my ongoing work is that this work highlights the accessibility and conceptual affordances of some practices that elementary students are very rarely asked to do. They're very rarely asked to define the variables that they're looking at. They're very rarely asked to think about how an experiment is actually a model of a more complex phenomenon. A, they can do it, and B, their talk is conceptually richer when they do it. I think it also supports the idea that carefully opening up curriculum in very purposeful ways is a productive way to design instruction. And it helps me understand the importance of integrating discourse and argumentation into the ongoing work of science, as opposed to it being something that's done after the data is collected in an experiment. And these are implications I've been exploring in my work with teachers, as I will briefly discuss now. So the question I've been trying to understand with teachers is, what would it look like to support teachers to open up their curriculum, elementary teachers, to increased uncertainty and therefore increased engagement for scientific practices? And there are lots of reasons to believe this is going to be really challenging work to do. First of all, the curriculum that elementary teachers are used to using, as I talked about, really specifies each step of what students should be doing and focuses on the canonical understanding. So it's likely to be scary to give up the control of doing things step by step. How will I get to that desired understanding? Second, as numerous researchers have shown, elementary teachers don't tend to feel particularly confident in teaching, either in their knowledge of some of the practices listed in NGSS, and certainly some of these more specific experimental practices I'm looking at, or in instantiating them in classrooms with their students. So I've done so far one initial pilot study of looking at how I'd help teachers understand this perspective in elementary school. The participants were a district professional science leader with whom I co-designed the professional development, 6 volunteer second grade teachers in her district, so 6 teachers who were interested in revisiting their curriculum and understanding the practices, and 1 student teacher that I was working with in my methods class. The context is a relatively high-achieving district. It's in a state that has not yet adopted the next generation science standards, but where everyone knows they're considering doing so within the next 3, 4, 5 years. So it was a really nice opportunity for me to work with the district leader, who was A, trying to understand whether her curriculum would allow students to engage in these practices, and B, trying to understand what supports she'd want to provide to her teachers to get them ready for the next generation science standards. The duration of the professional development was 1 year, and we met 4 times for full-day meetings in September, January, April, and June. The main conjectures that guided this work were first that when teachers open up their curriculum to uncertainty and variation in student thinking, they can seed approximations of the NGSS practices. So these forms of uncertainty will lead to these practices, but that B, they're going to need to support to know what to do with variability in student thinking that emerges from this uncertainty. And the way that I tried to support this through the design was by engaging teachers in 4 forms of activity. So 1, we did and then debriefed scientific activities in which uncertainty was carefully designed. And we talked about what those forms of uncertainty were and how they supported and what practices we were engaging in from the NGSS and what the relationship between uncertainty and the practices was. The teachers then planned adaptations to their materials, their kit materials, and actually what we did was they were all working on the same kit. So we took 1 kit that they all taught, an insects unit, and they all worked on rethinking that 1 kit in light of what we were doing together. And they were all teaching the kit at different points in the year, which was very much to our advantage, because what they did then was after each PD session, the teacher who was teaching it next went back and tried something out, inviting me or a grad student into her classroom to videotape. And then we brought that videotape back and looked at what that teacher tried, what practices students engaged in, what features of the learning environment we thought supported engagement in the practice, and what problems were coming up for us, what was difficult about doing this work, what we wanted to work on next. And then depending on what I was noticing and what the teachers were discussing and wanted, we explored the use of particular tools. So for example, Jen Cartier and colleagues' 5 practices in science discussion, which helps teachers think about after you've posed a cognitively demanding task, how do you support discussion about it in which students move forward. So in my analysis, what I've been looking at so far, and this is fairly preliminary, I'm presenting this for the first time at NARST in a few weeks, doesn't look like that on mine screen. So the first is, how does teachers understand uncertainty and incorporate it into their work with students? And then what aspects of the professional development seem supportive of teachers' development of ideas and practices related to uncertainty? And this is work I'm conducting with a graduate student at CU Boulder. So as we began to analyze teachers' practice and their talk, what we found is there's 3 major spheres within which they were thinking about uncertainty and relating these forms of uncertainty. So one is uncertainty associated with the discipline of science. What does it mean for scientists to experience uncertainty? Second was uncertainty for students. So what kind of decisions should students be asked to make? What should they wrestle with? What does that mean for their success and what they're doing? And the third was teaching uncertainty. So what do teachers control and not control? What are the implications for what I can predict and control in my classroom? And usually they explicitly related these forms of uncertainty and often noticed tensions between them in their talk. So we found this a productive way to analyze what they were thinking about. And one of the things actually that surprised me, and I want to talk a little bit about the teachers I worked with, how they thought about this at the beginning. I sort of predicted that one way to think about this would be like no uncertainty, right? Science is about particular ideas. I need to support students to learn those ideas, and I do so by supporting each step of the way, as I showed the experiments tend to do, and then I know what I'm doing. We found that a number of our teachers actually came in valuing uncertainty, and we thought of this as a really interesting resource for us. But here's what their initial view tended to look like. So the teachers that had, I think these are the teachers that had volunteered for our work, if you think about it, right? Because we're sort of recruiting teachers who consider themselves as already being people who want to do this. So they thought about, our teachers tended to think about science as having these messy aspects. Scientists do stuff, it's messy, it's hands-on, it's exciting. And I want my students to experience some of that. They tended to report themselves as planning some student choice into their science instruction, and that the result of that was an increased student engagement and critical thinking. But they tended also to identify like really key tensions for themselves in doing that work. So doing that meant giving up control. They called it controlled chaos. They often talked about how other teachers would come into their room and not be able to see what they were doing. And they talked about it as providing so much, leading to so much tension for them that they almost like carefully measured out the dollops of uncertainty. So they'd have like one experiment in which kids could do whatever they wanted and create all this stuff. And then they'd come in at the end and give them the canonical understanding, or that wouldn't be linked to their curriculum. It would be kind of like a Science Wednesday in which we do this messy science. My kids do all this exciting stuff, they engage in such critical thinking, but I keep that separate from my district kids. So as a result of this, as we began to design and redesign the PD, we adjusted our plans to try to use this approach as a resource, but also to challenge it for teachers, to ask how we could help them intervene more purposefully, minimize the teaching uncertainty, but not unproductively minimize the student uncertainty, if that makes sense. So how can we keep the student uncertainty, but make it a little more certain for teachers how they're using this to meet their goals? And so I want to talk about, over the course of the professional development, these like 3 constellations of ideas about uncertainty that began to emerge, and that I'm still trying to understand the implications of, so I'd love help thinking this through. So one is, and this was sort of, I'm going to present them in the kind of way they emerged and were really taken up. I am not saying in any way that these are like stages of teacher understanding, that we should be moving from one through the other. I think probably they're all productive resources, but I'm still like thinking about how do we use them productively. So one is that by reducing the uncertainty of science somewhat by saying, okay, scientists engage in this messy process, but they have specific considerations. They tend to control variables. They tend to define variables. So I want students to experience this whole process, but what I'm going to do is model or provide timely support so that they can engage in each of these aspects of science that I think are important. So providing scaffolds for student work. Modeling and meeting with students, making clear these decisions, but then basically making them for students was typical of what we saw at the beginning. Another thing that emerged for teachers and that they found very powerful was the idea that science is iterative. So they realized in their first uncertain science activity they did with us that they didn't design the experiment correctly the first time, and that they saw the mistakes in it and redesigned it. So they started building in a lot of redesign opportunities for their students and see that as really powerful. And that became a point where they could do some teaching. So it's kind of like putting off the work of telling kids the answer or the correct way to do it. Let them experience mistakes, help them think about those mistakes, then say, well, now let's try it this way, and let them try it again. And the final is one that was much more evident, I think, in my talk and the district science leaders' talk, and that I think teachers were making progress on, but was a tricky one. This is how I think about, so science is this purposeful simplification. And I'm going to look at my notes for this one, because I want to actually explain it in a way that's clear and concise. But so this is similar to this view of uncertainty that I depicted previously. The world is complex and messy. Scientists have to wrestle with aspects of it and simplify it in order to communicate with each other and agree on something shared. And so doing this work means that students actually have to communicate with each other to agree on a shared way to do something together. And the teacher's role then is to find ways to set up this debate, to select ideas to be debated, and then I would argue to provide new experiences that help students narrow ideas. I have this in italics because I think this is this other piece that was more difficult. And so I want to share really briefly, like, what does it look like for a teacher in this professional development to be thinking about uncertainty in this way. So this is a teacher who's debriefing on a video in the last PD session. A teacher had done the experiment with students, and students had found they had different findings about whether the crickets preferred to hide, to be under and in surfaces, or to be out in the open. And the teacher, and this teacher, the students, that led to a debate in students saying, like, how do we define hiding? What does it mean for crickets to be hiding? So the teacher said, I would say that before I took part of this pilot, I would have said they couldn't decide what was hiding, and I would have said they're hiding if they're underneath, and so I would have been right there to move them along. And I think that's the importance of spreading this view of science to our teammates. It's not about getting it done, it's about allowing that, another teacher said, process. Kind of, well, you decide how you're gonna do this. You decide how many houses you're gonna put in there. Because before I would have said, put in one house. I would have straightened it, and they would have collected the data. Yeah, it's like, like that control. They would have collected the data because I would want consistent data. And now what we're seeing is that we have inconsistent data, and that is something that's actually desirable because that's going to cause the children to rethink things. So I would say this is a movement beyond just science should be maximally uncertain for students, and that's a problem for teachers because this teacher is able to identify specific aspects of science, this definition of hiding, that she wants the students to engage in, but also, like, here the inconsistent data isn't something that's just uncertain and problematic. It's actually a tool for students to realize why they need to debate something. Now, what I don't have here, and what I've been thinking about as the next step, is how the teacher then guides that discussion. So what does the teacher do once she has these different ideas about hiding? And how does she feel she actually can use that to develop particular content understandings and to deepen that practice with her students? So I can talk, one of the additional findings that I think I'll skip over, but I'm happy to talk about in more depth if you're interested, is the role of this initial uncertain activity that we did with the teachers, because we took a kit activity and we redesigned it. We had thought the teachers would use this to redesign others of their own experiments. What we found is they all enacted the same experiment, but that actually became a really neat resource for us in thinking about how we iterate around just one experiment over time. And that's something I'd actually like to carry over in my future work. But here's where I see this work going. So here are the 4 hypotheses that I'd like to explore in the future. And I'm, entering the 3rd year of my career doing this. So this is what I see as the next step, the research agenda, and this is where I would love feedback and ideas. So 1, there are key junctures in experiments that could profitably be opened up to elementary discussion and debate that aren't currently opened up in elementary classrooms. 2, I think that these discussions could be predictably elicited. Like, we could predict ahead of time when the kids are going to need to define hiding, when they're going to need to define death, or at least something about the plant's growth. So they could be predictably elicited given design features of the learning environment, tasks, and materials. And I have some ideas about those design features. 3, teachers need support to know what to do with students' ideas in those discussions and how to help them make progress through discussion and debate. So I've reduced uncertainty for teachers a little bit here. I think I can do that. And then I think teachers need to feel a little less uncertain about what to do at this stage. So a question I have going forward is, if we can get a handle on A to C above, can we develop curriculum materials that look somewhat different from the typical kits in elementary classrooms that would allow teachers to support this much richer participation in science practice in the elementary school years? So this is the work I see myself as moving into doing. And I'm open to questions about aspects of the talk I didn't get to, things you didn't understand, ideas about going forward.
All right, thanks, Eve. About 14 minutes for questions.
So I've been thinking about what it means to have uncertainty in like a lot of different ways, like measurement uncertainty, or even like you described where there's some uncertainty in the definitions we use and the decisions we make. Have you seen any examples of students reiterating their experiment to reduce measurement uncertainty?
Yeah. So I haven't, within this, I haven't done that work, but I would certainly think that they could. And so one way, and then I would think about like, well, what is the experience that would make that measurement uncertainty visible to them, right? Where they would then be able to relate that.
Yeah, that's exactly
back
what
to the
curious about.
process.
How would you get at that?
Yeah. Yeah, there's some nice work on data representation where, you'd actually want to be able to help the kids create these data displays where they could see the spread of the data and say like, well, can we, it's like the start of statistical reasoning. Can we reliably draw a conclusion? What would it mean? What level of uncertainty would we feel comfortable with? And can we iterate on our process if we don't think we're comfortable? I would think that would be really interesting. Yeah, Alicia.
So both of the examples you used were life science examples, and so I'm wondering if you feel as if you could make the same kinds of predictions for physical science or other earth science curricula, or do you feel like your understanding of what the junctures look like is limited to life science?
So what I've found, and I haven't, I'm trying to think if I did, these same teachers and I talked a little bit about a force in motion unit because some of them wanted to take this work forward into force in motion after they taught this. So this is just about me personally, where I found I feel like I'm one step better at predicting it because I can use this kind of thought process. Like I always think in the terms of the kids, like, well, given what I know about the content area, like what would the kids think about, did they do this experiment? Like what kinds of uncertainty might be built in that would predict these forms of thinking? I can't do it the first time in anything. Like that's what I find with this kind of work. Like I feel like you need to do it, 3-4 times. So like what I found is there's this interesting process where like the first time I do it, I can predict some. Then these other moments come up and I say like, oh, that's a really important moment. I don't want that not to just come up for this one student in their group work next time, but I want to think how can that come up for everyone? And then I redesign so that comes up for more of the kids. And then I can actually see oh, and what should we do with it? So I don't know, for me, it just takes these iterations of doing this. So my hunch is to do these curriculum development, you would need to actually really do that work, those iterations several times. I don't know, 4, 5, 6, I don't know how many. Yes, David.
So, I'll put in a little pitch for our NAR session. So we're going to do a NAR session somewhat about this. And one thing that Amelia and I are going to talk about and are curious about, and I would love to hear you think about, is what's hard for teachers about this, right? So one thing that we find with especially our pre-service teachers is that they've just never seen these practices before, right? So we think of them, our students started talking about them as invisible practices. They're like, oh, there really are these things in science that I've never been exposed to before.
Yeah.
So when you're working with teachers, what seems to be hard for them, or some of the hang-ups about doing this kind of work with kids?
Yeah, so absolutely. One thing I've found is that how, any of the practices in next generation science standards are written is they're really useful for getting the discussion going, but the level at which they have to be unpacked for teachers to be able to recognize something that students are doing as productive and worthwhile is substantial. So we found that this experiment that we had them do was a really useful start to that. What I haven't done is really analyze, they're talking about the practices. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, was so slippery, what they identified as a particular practice and how they thought about what went into it. I found that just slippery and hard to talk about. So absolutely that aspect of just getting more specific in their descriptions of well, what is it you want to see? What do we value? And for, I guess for high school teachers as well, especially for elementary teachers. And then, so that's absolutely one aspect we struggled with. And I do think this movement around what I found is and I'm sure everyone else has seen this, the teachers are absolutely doing this really active work of rethinking their goals at the same time as they're thinking about this. And they're saying, well, are you telling me I don't, care about content understanding anymore? Or what is it that I value? And how do I make sense of like what my goals are for students and what this means I'm giving up is something that I feel like I'm still getting better at helping teachers think through. Because I feel like for them, there had to be that meta level discourse about values at the same time as there was this more specific work looking at like the actual teaching they were doing.
So I guess I'll build on that, and I'm thinking about, so several of us have a project in which we're looking at how teachers are noticing and responding to kid sense making in the moment, and how it is that teachers might decide what to do in the moment, if they want to table a comment or proceed with it or reject it, and how that impacts the subsequent activities in the class, right? So this work is really focused on particular aspects of that, right? So getting kids to think more about the investigations and what are good investigations. Are the teachers struggling a little bit to figure out, I mean, there's that, and there's like content ideas that they want, and then there's like participation goals that they might have, and like trying to get, right? So have you seen them navigate those different things, and have some of them struggled more or less with navigating those goals, or mainly are you all focused on these goals, and so that's what everyone's discussing?
Like in terms of what I could see when they actually made a choice in the discussion.
Right.
Yeah, that isn't, I mean, I absolutely believe that would be an issue. I saw it mostly in the discussion of goals, because what happened, which was really interesting, as the teachers like enacted this activity in their teaching, you know, because this was a pilot study, we really just went and saw the things that they invited us to go see. And they invited us to go see this work around this crickets investigation. And so what was interesting for me was like, the three sets of teachers that I watched, and you know, I can make no claims about this as like this trajectory, because it was three teachers, we'd done different things at different times, but it was like they enacted the experiment piece first. And they were doing all this supporting of like these aspects they were trying to even get out there. Then the next step was like they backed off a little and they enacted it, but tried to let some of those like come out more fluidly. And then they built in the discussion at the end. It was like, so they almost took it, we demonstrated kind of and talked about that whole set, that whole whatever trajectory from design and experiment through discussion. But for some reason, as they enacted it and like what they talked about, they did it in this like kind of chronologic way, and I'm not sure why, like what happened in the community that made that happen in this case. So it's just, that's just to say I don't think I would have had opportunity to see that as much, but in how they talked about their goals, I absolutely saw that as an issue. And like really, I think the piece I didn't get to, and wasn't as successful as they really thinking about, okay, now like your really desired content goal, how did doing this work allow you to make progress on that? And which ideas related to that? We didn't do that mapping, but really which ideas related to that were you able to draw on through this work? And I think that would be really important to do and to help them think through. But we just didn't get there in this.
I do have one more question. I don't know if anybody else wants to ask. It's a totally different question about student participation.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, please go.
I think it's really interesting when you're thinking about the uncertainty that you want to build in for this science. And one thing that we're struggling with is there's also a lot of uncertainty about student ideas within when you're doing this type of work that you want to try and model for teachers. Are you seeing that that students are bringing up new ideas that teachers couldn't have predicted because they're engaging them in these new types of practices?
Yes, I'm trying to think of like a really concrete example. There was this fascinating, so a lot of what came up for teachers that they'd never thought about before was again, and it's interesting, I just keep seeing this coming up, this like relationship between the experiment and the actual phenomenon is like somehow never thought about in elementary school. So like these teachers had all looked at crickets for like many, many years with their students. But all of these questions suddenly about like crickets in the wild, and like one of the students brought up the idea of like, well, is this a native species or was this like a store-bought species, and would that matter? And I think the teachers they were suddenly like, well, they saw the power of that, in that creating this cricket habitat and comparing it to crickets in the wild like actually allows students to think about really important things about cricket needs, crickets' relation to their habitats. but they were, again, like really, there was this unsureness for them about like which of those ideas was kind of most important. Well, that's problematic. Now we're saying that the experiment doesn't represent the crickets. Like, does that matter? And there's really interesting questions of like, well, how can kids actually see and make claims about habitats by only seeing one habitat? There's a lot of like really rich discussion around like habitat and their understanding of habitat came up as they started to think about, you know, these crickets in this little plastic container and like what that helped kids or could or could not help kids understand. So that was really interesting and I think a little like overwhelming for them in the moment that it came up.
So my question is about kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really wondering, I don't have a good sense for what the kids actually look like and what they were doing and how they were participating right now. But I'm wondering, since you're essentially introducing totally different norms to the class, that this orients kids in different ways, right? And so are you, I mean, I'm sure you're seeing some different kinds of participation, but I can imagine this uncertainty being very unsettling, especially for kids who might feel insecure about their status in the class or are not dominant in varieties of ways. And I'm wondering how you saw them being positioned in the class and how they responded and how kids in general responded to these new norms.
Yes, that is a really great question. So if I think back to like the experiment that I showed you, that took place in February in a year. So the kids, and what I'd love to do yet but haven't yet done is like actually track like agreement and disagreement across the year, like how often kids intervened to like construct a new idea, agree and disagree with each other. That's one of those dreams I have, like, oh, I have this giant data set. That's what I'll do. Of course, I can't seem to do it. But so I would say that we really carefully thought about the development of those norms across a year. And it was interesting because the teacher I worked with for my dissertation, I wouldn't say her strength was in her content understanding of science, but she was deeply committed to kids thinking and also deeply committed to like recognizing and valuing each kid in her classroom. So as we designed together, like she absolutely held us accountable to those things. So we started off like really small. Like one of the initial activities we did with kids each year was we had the kids go out to the backyard and each draw a picture of a plant in the backyard. And then we put up the picture and we said, can anyone make a claim that two kids drew the same plant? And like, what about? And so they're basically like coming up and sorting these pictures and saying, well, I think this one and this one might have been the same. Well, like, what makes you think that? And do we know for sure? So it's like a much lower stakes, like you're coming up in a quick moment, you're making and supporting a claim. We're talking about how we're representing things. I find drawing a really nice way to start with elementary kids in thinking about like what shows something, what hides something, which is a nice start to like what scientists do in terms of purposeful simplification. So I would say, yes, those norms are like built in and carefully developed over the year. And then in terms of like what we were able to do, it absolutely, it depends. We saw different forms of participation at different times. So sometimes in these like raucous debates where everyone is jumping in at once, that tended to be some of like the like louder, more confident students. We then also tried to develop times where we did a lot of partner work. We did a lot of sort of carefully structured presentations where the teacher was choosing a student because she knew that student had an idea that was valuable to the class and making sure that student came up, even if that was a student who generally felt less confident. But then the student knew ahead of time, like why, we introduced that student, being like, this student saw something no one else saw. So absolutely building that in, I think, really carefully matters a lot.
All right, let's give you another round of applause. We have 3 Kristen things for you.
Oh, excellent.
And that too.
Neat, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all right. Thanks everybody for coming.